have their children in childcare as well as maintaining a job. Going on to Advantage 1. Children. A is going to be the uniqueness. One is that child delinquency is increasing right now. The little A is that some families that go back to work, it has led to children being locked in cars. There have been several instances, as reported by the Times, showing that there have been children left in a car when someone that thinks that they can make it through a shift by leaving them there and just checking on them in breaks. This leads to we'll get into that later. But the Views at the Times also reports that the child delinquency in the U.S. is increasing sharply due to lack of supervision. When families do decide to go back to work, they leave their children unsupervised, and this leads to them to an increase in arrests and an increase in the juvenile population. The C is that 1.2 million children don't have childcare, and their families have no way of actually creating childcare, which means that all of these children are basically going unsupervised, or their families don't have the ability to work. The second argument here is that childcare is key to education. The little A is that after-school programs are extremely helpful when they work through homework with kids to make sure that they understand it. Additionally, there's extra programs that will make sure that they're learning more than learning more than what they're just learning in school, which is uniquely key. Additionally, the B point here is that preschool has led to higher graduation rates. Children who have the ability to attend preschool programs or going to daycare have the ability to get ahead and learn things earlier, and it teaches them how to learn, which then helps them throughout the entirety of their grammar school process, which leads to them actually graduating. The solvency is going to be one that the plan passes and this funds programs, so it helps people get their children into childcare because it helps open up spaces and helps the quality of these programs go up. The second point here is that this allows children to gain that extra education, and it allows them to be supervised. When you have someone standing over you, you are much less likely to be running around doing whatever you want and getting pulled in because you don't have supervision and because it's pretty much illegal for children to run around the streets by themselves. So the impacts here is going to be one, you decrease delinquency. The little A is that when a child goes into the juvenile system, they are much more likely to have a reoccurring offense, which puts them back, and this makes it so that they can't go to school and they can't get proper education, but additionally it makes it so it's harder for them to get jobs in the future because it creates a cycle of most of the time bad behavior, and that makes them go back into the system. A high amount of children who have been in the juvenile system then become adults who go to jail when they are older, which means that they never have the ability to get out of the cycle that's creating, and this pushes them into poverty because they don't have the ability to ever get jobs in the future. The second here is that this gives education. Education is uniquely key to allowing people to access jobs. You can see that it was upwards of 80% it was 2 in 3 jobs are going to require a bachelor's degree soon, which means that these children need to be successful if they want to have a chance of having a job in the future. Anything else?
I'm good.
Going on to Advantage 2. Domestic violence. A is going to be the uniqueness is one that survivors of violence have a very hard time getting back to work. The little A here is that they generally, a lot of the times they come from situations where their money was held in a purse string and their abusers were not allowing them to access bank accounts of their own, hold their own credit cards in their own names, or basically have any access to money. So they have no ability when they do leave to have their own finances because they didn't have it before. The little B here is that 1 in 4 survivors have no source of revenue whatsoever and no ability to do this. Additionally, a lot of these women have children that they have to support and that they have to take care of, and women who wind up in shelters and have nowhere else to go. They have several children but no one to watch their child and no one to actually free up their time so that way they can go to job interviews and actually get out. The second here is that this leads to survivors going back when they have no ability to finance their life, and they have no ability to get out of a bad situation with not having any money. Then they start to gravitate back towards their abuser. It leads to these women and children winding up back in these situations, which is probably pretty bad if you're being abused at home. So, going on to solvency. One is that increasing funding allows for the expansion of these programs, which allows these women to get their children into the programs, and it opens up more seats, which means that they can do this. A lot of women are on waiting lists. They have their children on waiting lists, but the waiting lists are too long for them to actually get them in. The second here is that this increases time for them, which means that they can actually go out and interview. When they have the ability to interview, then they have the chance of getting a job, and they have the ability to actually create a source of revenue. So the impact here is going to be one, you decrease systemic violence when you have less women going back to their abusers, and more being able to go out and actually create a living for themselves. It means that you have less people in these situations. Abusive situations lead to negative things such as psychological effects that then not only harm the people that are being abused, but additionally the children, who then usually get trapped in a cycle of domestic violence, where a lot of the times they then go on to act out violently, and this hurts them. Especially. It is key for them to be able to get out of these situations and be able to move forward and live a healthy life. Anything else?
On Advantage 1, can you impact poverty?
On Advantage 1, on poverty. Basically, when people don't have money, they have to choose between things like medicine and food, and when they have to make those choices, they're being pushed into a forced choice of how they die.
Internalized that impact pretty quick. It was very impressive. 3 seconds. Cool. So yeah, there are going to be 3 different off-case positions. Nothing insane, nothing crazy out of the ordinary. And then we'll get to case with the time remaining. And I'll be sure to signpost along the way for everybody. Cool. Everyone ready? You guys ready?
Good to go.
All right. Very cool. All right, the first position is going to be the federalism disadvantage uniqueness. The first argument under the uniqueness is that federalism is currently high within the status quo. The A argument under here is within the energy sector. The recent changes ceded more control to the states because states now have control over the choices of fuel used to produce energy for their specific state and the ones used in the specific power generation facilities. The B argument under here is the courts. The courts have begun to make decisions on the side of states over the federal government, and legal commentators have referred to the recent output of these decisions as, quote, the Federalist Revolution. The C argument under here is marijuana. With the legalization of marijuana in now 4 United States states and territories combined, this proves that federalism is on the rise in the status quo. The link. First argument of the link is that the Fed does something that could be easily done by the states, and something currently done by the states in some capacity. But the second argument under here is that fiat is durable, which means when the Supreme Court will rule on plan, this will be solidified and officially codified as law, which permanently takes this power away from the states and permanently solidifies it as a federal government power. But the third argument of the link is, at the very least, this is a reversal of current federalist funding, even if you don't buy the second link. At the very least, in general, states have had the leeway and ability to do this in the past, and they're changing that in the status quo. I'll get to the bottom of the internals. The first internal link is that federalism resolves conflicts like Ukraine. The A argument under here is that territorially based autonomy has been implemented as a conflict management resolution in many divided states throughout history. The B it was used especially in the breakup of Yugoslavia into Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Serbia. The B argument under here is that this dispenses power making and making domination by one single entity less likely. The point at which power becomes more communalized in local communities, you take it away from one central force. But the C argument under here is that this ensures that electoral results are going to be viewed as legitimate, as opposed to just pure domination by one side over another. When you're decentralizing power, makes electoral results significantly more legitimate because you can avoid giant singular uprisings. But the second argument of the internal links is that the Ukraine, we'll get there in a minute. The second argument of the internal links is that Ukraine needs federalism to resolve their current crisis. The little and here is that the recent governments in Kiev have tended to draw disproportionately on Ukraine's 2 large segments of the population, the west side of the nation versus the southeast nation. It's currently a competition as to which one controls domination of the federal government. But the B argument over here is that one of the laws they enacted in the post-Yanukovych government revoked the use of Russian as the official language, which means this intensified the mistrust that local communities have with the government and these local smaller communities have with the federalized power in the government. The C argument over here is that decentralization, especially if accompanied by language rights, would diffuse tensions created, and it would diffuse political power if the system were to be modeled. And the next argument under here is that Ukraine will model the United States government. The first argument under here is that the Ukraine Prime Minister in his most recent speech is that he's specifically stated that he looks to the United States when modeling what the future of his country will look like. He very specifically stated that he is looking for a federalist system to divide Ukraine into multiple states and municipalities that would each have delegates and representatives in doing their own policies based on the United States system. But the second argument here is the collapse of the states' rights in the United States means a collapse of the states' rights in Ukraine. At the point in which Ukraine is modeling their entire system based on the United States, and we right away, strictly and fundamentally, rip a power that was previously reserved for the states and make it codified officially as a federal policy, we remove any impetus for Ukraine to be able to solve its solution in that way. Moving on to the impacts. The first argument is going to be that of Russian aggression. A central Ukraine government is not something that Russia is really super excited about. Russia is currently incredibly excited at the thought of a federalist Ukraine based on like localized municipalities as opposed to one giant centralized government, which means Russian aggression is inevitable. But the second argument here is Ukraine aggression, because they're going to try and ride back and fight Russia, because they're not just going to sit there idly by and let Russia engage them in the same thing, especially when they're very likely in a world post plan to have one powerful centralized government. And the third argument is that this is going to spill over, which can lead to a regional spillover and an international spillover. In essence, people will die. You'll have a very large amount, even if like a lot of people don't die in war, at the very least, hundreds of thousands of people are going to be displaced. And displaced persons are more than 3 to 4 times as likely to be sold into things like sex slavery and the sex trade. And those are things that we think are bad and probably should be avoided. I'm so sorry I missed your guys' questions.
That's fine.
I've got a question.
Yeah, for sure.
Has Ukraine indicated that they're going to revise their constitutional structure in any time soon? And if so, when?
Yes?
Yes, they have. That specifically that when they are looking at a transitional government and being able to negotiate with the rebels, and they want to be able to figure out basically like a solution to give more autonomy towards these rebel, or the groups that are closer to Russia that are like want to be more Russian. So yes.
Cool. And anyway, the counter plan. The next off of the case position is the counter plan. The counter plan: the 50 United States and all relevant territories should provide $80 billion to expand the Child Care and Development Fund. Again, the counter plan is the 50 United States and all relevant territories should provide $80 billion to expand the Child Care and Development Fund. Our first argument under here is that government child care support is done a lot by states in the status quo, but the second argument under here is that government child care also could be done by states within the status quo, which means they equally could have like not necessarily stripped away this funding. But the next argument under here is that the state funding is better in this instance. The little A under here is that states are going to be having a better understanding of their local demographics. Specifically, the warrant here is going to be for that of Oregon. For example, their uniqueness on their advantage is generally true. The child delinquency is up, but in the state of Oregon, very specifically, child delinquency is incredibly linked right now to racist drug policy and racist police enforcing. The state of Oregon has the highest amount of black teens in prison of any state in the union, even though we have a very you're right, as a percentage, not a pure number, but as a percentage of population, and there the child delinquency has very specifically to do with drug policy and less to do with the ability to find child care for those individuals, which means the intricacies of states are becoming increasingly important. But the B argument under here is that those states can better appropriate their resources into specific avenues and specific policies through this fund that gives grants to states to ultimately be able to combat the specificities of their localized issues. And the C argument under here is that this is basically the situations are going to vary state to state, which means one blanket federalized policy is no way going to be able to solve for the specific intricacies of every single state. And the D argument here is that CP can fully resolve these differing circumstances among that, in addition to solving the entirety of the affirmative, because it functionally provides the same amount of funding. Yeah.
So is each state going to provide $80 billion?
No. The 50 states combined would pool $80 billion.
How are you going to divide
by
that?
population? So the states with a higher population get like a proportional amount of funding based on the population.
So, and your plan just doesn't say federal government, so states are paying
yes,
for
I'll
this
pay
out
it
of their
for
budgets.
yes, either through tax increases or deficit spending. We'll claim normal means.
Yeah.
Deficit spending?
Cool. Okay, on to the last position, which is that of politics, uniqueness. The first argument is that the GOP senators have stated in their State of the Union responses that they're going to give the TPA authority to break down the trade barriers, which means the fast track is happening now. The second argument here is that Obama has already made the battles that he's going to face in the future key and explicit in his State of the Union, which means he knows exactly what he's going for. Everyone knows exactly what he's going for. The links. First argument of the links is that this costs Obama political capital. The A argument here is that if he picks this one main piece of the State of the Union, it means he's only going to get that one because of the B argument, which is that winners lose, which means he's going to have to spend significantly to push this issue through. But the second argument of the links is that the GOP hates federal spending on childcare. The A argument over here is that this fits the narrative that community and churches should do it, and B, this additionally fits the narrative that poor people are just additionally mooching off the government. The internal links. First argument of the internal links is that Obama does not have enough capital to demand a fast track, and if he does have enough extra capital and if he doesn't have enough extra capital to push through the trade agreements, he won't be given the TPA authority. But the second argument over here is that fast track gives us free trade because of the up and down vote, which means there's no debate and because there's no amendments. The third argument over here is that free trade in the South Pacific creates protections on intellectual property, which is especially necessary for things like pharmaceuticals and so individuals aren't given half doses. When individuals are given half doses of pills because these companies aren't able to trademark their things, it allows diseases to mutate, which is why we've seen an increase in like the measles and all these eradicated things, and that's our impact.
We're going to start with the counterclaim, and then we're going to go to the politics aside, and then federalism, and then case, which will go in the order of advantage 1 and advantage 2. You want me to do that? Alright, it's gonna be case on top then, because Grace says that I have to. Not that I have to do that shit. So case on top, whatever, advantage 1, advantage 2, then it will be the counter plan, the politics dissad, the federalism dissad. Everybody good? Yeah, cool.
Extended bid, one goes completely conceded, and you extend specific argumentation says that federal government spending is necessary because the fact that knowledge is provided for better access to an existing policy means that has been proven effective. Additionally, you look to the fact that the $80 billion comes specifically from the Child Care and Federal Development Fund. Like, this is going to be a problem in the counterplan debate when they're giving money to a federal program via the states can't do it that way. It's an indication that the counterplan is intrinsically flawed. Means the plan is the only way that's able to resolve this. Means that you can extend the impacts coming off of advantage 1 about how the providing for childcare is going to be uniquely key in order to be able to resolve back with the impact we talked about. Advantage 2 goes completely conceded as well, which means that when they don't make any arguments about how the counterplan is uniquely able to resolve with the affirmative plan, it means that you will prefer the argumentation that we're giving you that says that the violence attack is systemic. Means that even if there's a risk that the affirmative is able to resolve better, means that you will prefer the impacts coming off here that says that the violence that says that systemic violence that happens here is going to be worse and more probable.
Extend that this is given to state grants, which means that we're probably
Yeah, we're going to make these arguments on the counterplan as well, but we're giving it's a state-based program. It gives state grants to the states to issue these programs. Is an indication of why the affirmative plan not only results, but the federalism does have better as a result of the actual giving the resources that states already need when they don't have the funding. Is an indication of why the affirmative plan is going to be better and probably resolves federalism better on these states' counterplan. First argument is going to be permutation do both. Permutation do both. The USFG should provide $80 billion to the Child Care and Development Fund, and the 50 states not relevant territories should, I guess, collectively provide $80 billion to the Child Care and Development Fund. The first argument under this is that these two things are not mutually exclusive. You can have the United States federal government provide this money and have the states work through their own existing policies in order to do this. There's no reason why these two things are mutually exclusive. Additionally, second is that the counterplan solves back for the federalism just have better. By having a combination of these state programs, and federal programs, it means that it leads to a balance of powers between the federal government and the states, as opposed to just it's entirely state-based program. We say the state-based, that entirely focus on the state-based program is always going to be worse because it means the states can implement things like racist policies as a result of things like Jim Crow laws. Is an indication of why a balance between the federal government implementing these programs is always going to be preferable. But additionally, the next argument, there's no solvency because of the fact that the states don't have and cannot provide for the money through the Child Care Development Fund when it's a federal government program. Is an indication of why the affirmative is the only one that's able to provide through this plan text. Be very stringent on the counterplan text. This is the text that they have provided. Is an indication do not allow for the MO to shift this to say they're going to provide a model or some action like that. Is an indication why you should hold them to this action. Additionally, the next argument is that state grants will solve best because of the fact that not only has they been empirically proven that it's allowed for the creation of state-based programs for child care access, but additionally that more funding is necessary, that the federal government is the only one that's able to provide this funding, which means the next argument, the disadvantage of the counterplan, that of state budgets. That state budgets are on breaking status quo. There's been some substantial decreases in state funding. You look to California as an excellent example here, where over the last couple of years, California has run a several $billion deficit, and the deficit is a result of things like education policies and indication of why state budgets are on breaking status quo. Additionally, the next argument is that the plan is going to lead to a substantial overstretch of state-based programs. That if the states have to come up with this money on their own, means that they can't do things like deficit spending. That the states not only by their own internal laws and constitutions have to be able to be within their own balanced budget. These are laws that have been implemented in places like Utah. Is an indication of why they can't do deficit spending. But additionally, this means that there's going to be an overstretch and more taxes in order to be able to implement this. It means there's an overstretch of the state-based programs. The impact of this is that an overstretch of the state-based program is going to lead to a collapse of things like social programs. That many social programs are provided through the state-based through the states. You can look to Medicaid as an example here that the Affordable Care Act provided for an expansion of state-based Medicaid programs. However, the states still had to provide for a chunk of this money. Means that this would be a loss of that kind of money. It indicates this would lead to worse poverty, worse access to worse access to things like healthcare. Is an indication of why it's being an independent impact.
Their own warrant of Oregon having racist laws is probably a pretty big reason why states are going to be
this is going to be the next argument. That states alone is also worse. You can notice their own example of Oregon that those racist policies by the state government is just empirical proof that the states implementing these policies in their own ways is always going to be worse. That's why you need to have a federal government that has an oversight to these abilities. It means that the affirmative plan would be preferable. Good.
Yeah.
Politics decided. The first argument is not unique that Obama has already placed his political capital into this program. Literally yesterday, he called for this plan to provide $80 billion for the Childcare and Development Fund as an indication of why he's already been spending his political capital on education policy and the status quo. Additionally, second is that there's no uniqueness story to this. The Republicans want to give Obama trade promotion authority. Not only do they believe in trade promotion authority, but additionally that this means that the next president, which they believe is going to be Republican, will also have it as an indication why Republicans will always give trade promotion authority, but additionally look to specific senators such as Orrin Hatch and John Thune, two moderate Democrats and two moderate Republicans within the Senate that both said that trade promotion authority is absolutely necessary as an indication of why political capital is not necessary in this instance. Additionally, the next argument is going to be turned that we provide that winners win, that when you create policies, when you create movement within your basic credit allows for a combination of your league and creates more political capital. Specifically in this instance, because trade promotion authority has had most of its staunch objections from Democrats, such as Harry Reid, who is the Senate Minority Leader, means that when we create a childcare policy that mobilizes the base, mobilizes individuals within the congressional Democrats, it means that will have more political capital in order to be able to pass things such as trade promotion authority. This is the major barrier in the path that Democrats propose to create a political capital within the Democratic Party to allow for trade promotion authority to pass. But additionally, the next argument is no internally that there's not going to be a free trade agreement any time in the near future. They make arguments about how this is going to lead to free trade agreements, but not only is there no free trade agreement that is currently ready to be passed through Congress, but additionally the closest one that exists is the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is at least 2 years out from being issued to Congress. An indication of why this not only will be during the next presidential cycle is an indication of why either this is going to die in Congress as a result of elections, but additionally that there is no reason, additionally probably the next president will be able to pass for these forms of trade agreements in case the affirmative is not, in case these arguments are not key. And we're good here?
Yeah.
On federalism this time? The first argument is non-unique, that federalism is terminally low. You can look to the Affordable Care Act as an excellent example about how this is a wide-reaching federal policy that overrode the states in a wide range of areas. You can look to the little A here that required the establishment of state-based health insurance programs. It was an indication to how this is a major requirement on the states, probably led to a major decrease in federalism. Additionally, to the you can look to the expansion of Medicaid on the state-based level, and there's something that many states indicated they didn't want in the first place, an indication of why federalism is probably decreasing in the South. Additionally, the next argument is going to be linked with this is not a unique instance. All the warrants that they say about federalism, increase energy courts, and marijuana are all completely exclusive from education. You look to if education is a federal policy and always has been a federal policy. You can look to the creation of the Department of Education is an example of how this was already been a federal power. It means there's no shift in this. Additionally, the next argument is turned that we're giving more power to the states. That the Child Care Development Fund is a state-based block grant policy. It indicates that we're giving more money to the states in order to be able to implement their policy. These would probably increase state power. But additionally, the next argument is that it's on the internal level. They say in other countries model as how we don't instill the forms of federalism that we have in our countries and other nations. You can do Iraq and Afghanistan. That's an example where we establish strong national governments as opposed to a federalism system in case we don't implement those programs.
Order is going to be counterplan. Federalism, politics, case in the order, and case in the order of advantage 1 and advantage 2. Alright, you all ready? I'm going to go line by line on the counterplan. The first argument they make is perm do both. First, it's not mutually exclusive. What we're going to argue is that though it's not mutually exclusive, they're still biting both of the dissats, so it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, I guess it isn't cool. Second argument here is they say that the counterplan solves back for the federalism dissat because of the balance of power and because the states are cash due raising. What we're going to argue is that that's not true and that is in the status quo, that the balance of power, even though they say that the federal government is the one that watches the states, that's still too much power on the federal government's part in the first place, and that because the federal government is the one that's giving the money in the the first place. They are the ones that are going to be controlling how the implementation happens in the first place. Look to the way that the federal government has controlled the states by using the state power in the past, like the highway taxes or the highway funding based on the drinking age and stuff is a good example of this, about how the drinking age was leveraged against the states, and so this becomes another example of the money being leveraged against the states in order for them to bind the federal will, which means that this is not going to resolve the disad in the first place that we're making. I'll get to your questions at the end of the counter plan. They say that third argument is that the states cannot afford, but they're not giving good analysis here. I'm going to give you specific examples of where the states can and already do afford plans like this. The first is the Oregon Health Plan. Second is the First Fight in California. Third is the Outdoor School Program in Oregon. Fourth is the CCAP in Louisiana, the Child Care Assistance Program. Fifth is the Washington Child Care Subsidy Program. Sixth is the Missouri Early Child Services, which also means that the infrastructure is in place, which means that this money could be leveraged from the states, which means that the only question now is if the counter plan is able to actually raise the money in the first place, and if they are able to, if that's going to be biting the state budget's disad in the first place. The fourth argument on the perm debuff is that the states is back in the background, that it empirically works. We'll get to this on the case arguments as well, but we would argue at least that the state's grants itself are not going to be as good because, again, the implementation problems on the counter plan, which means that our solvency arguments at least answer this back in the first place. Then they go on the state's budget disad. First argument, they say that state budgets are on the brink in California. We would argue that if this were true, then things like infrastructure spending should prove that their high-speed rail programs are significantly over budget, and yet they're not on the brink at all. The University of California system is substantially over budget, and yet it doesn't seem to matter in the grand scheme of things. California is still the leading, seventh largest country in the world. If they were their own state just by themselves, they are able to deficit spend, and because of usage of the American dollar, it means that it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. They don't have enough power to actually hurt the U.S. economy rapidly from something like a U.S. dollar being hurt in the first place. Second, they say overstretch because they can't deficit spend because of the law. We would argue that fiat is durable, and that means that even if they can't, that they would deficit spend in the first place. If they're going to argue utopianism in the first place, we would argue that the Aff is the same way, which means that we are guaranteeing that either deficit spending or tax increases happen because of this. I guess we would say deficit spending in the states where that's already legal in the first place, and the taxes in the second place. And they're not giving specific arguments as to why those taxes are bad. Their only impact is an overstretch because they've cut social programs and Medicaid. We would argue that they just increase taxes instead of cutting in the first place, and that we're doing pretty good analysis here. And at the point that they're not giving arguments about why new taxes are going to be specifically bad is the point that you don't give them any preponderance of impacts on this in the first place. Their last argument here is that the states, the federal government is key to checking racism in the states. What we would argue is that the federal government is also deeply racist. Look at the fact that the Civil Rights Commission didn't find any wrongdoing in the Trayvon Martin case in the first place, which means that at worst, they are just as bad and possibly even less bad than what
Department of Justice just cleared Darren Wilson.
Yeah, they cleared Darren Wilson. That's what I was talking about. That's what I meant. Yeah.
Okay, so you're changing every single state constitution to allow them to deficit spend via fiat in your counter.
What we will argue is that in the states where that can happen, it does. In the states that it doesn't, tax increases. What we argue is that fiat says that if we were to defend that, and if you want to stick us to that, we can. That fiat means that the money is not an issue, and it doesn't matter if it's in the Constitution, because the Aff gets to fiat stuff around the Constitution all the time. So, I mean, you can complain about that if you want. But federalism... First argument here is they say it's not unique that Obamacare proves that federalism is down. We would argue that that's not true at all, especially because Obamacare is based on a Massachusetts state program, because we're making good arguments about how federal policy gets dictated by state policy, and that's one of the reasons why the state's counterplan can uniquely solve, is because since state policies like these are what get implemented in the first place, this is an example of where federalism is a good thing, because maybe after the implementation throughout all the states it can go federal in the first place, but it's not something that has to happen immediately, and that's on the link analysis here, which means that the Obamacare example doesn't really work for their uniqueness. They can say all they want, but simply put, we have too many times the courts ruling for the states. We have the marijuana legislation, which is easily just as big. We have the energy sector. We have the fact that the federal government is not trying to shut down the marijuana dispensaries, or at least the Attorney General said that he's not going to enforce those laws in the states where it's legal, which means that the federal government is giving preponderance to states now in ways that they haven't since the Civil War, which means that we are simply winning the uniqueness debate here. On a link level, they say that it's exclusive for education, and that the education doesn't mean that, basically they don't link because they're not an example of taking power. And they say that the Department of Education means it's a federal issue. BS! The states have a shit ton of power with the education system. We don't have any form of federal education system. We don't even have a federal standardized test. Like, we have the AP and the SAT, but all the states have their own standardized testing as to how they look at success. And that moreover, the Department of Education is really an oversight body, but not one that has direct control over the way that states work with the schools in the first place. And that means that you're going to want to give preponderance to us on the link level, particularly because this is a way huge place that the states are acting in the first place. And they say term because it gives power to the states. We would argue that no, it doesn't, because again, cross-applying the analysis I put on the money issue about how the federal when the federal government's the one that puts the money on in the first place, it gives them control. Again, that's the same analysis about the drinking age thing. On the internal link level, they say that it's central in other communities. They say that we've created centralized governments in other communities, and we would argue that that's not true. There's a lot of zones in like Afghanistan stuff where there's a lot of like tribal rule and stuff among those specific tribes, and that was done as a way to try to stop a lot of conflict in that region, which means that they're simply not winning on the empirics here. And even if they are, and the fact that Ukraine is specifically modeling us, and that they say they're modeling us, it becomes a moot point in the first place, because it's not the U.S. that's creating these governments in Ukraine. We have nothing to do with it. It's Ukraine doing it themselves, which means we are simply winning. They're dropping the impact level on here. We would argue that this is probably going to outweigh, because child delinquency would definitely go up in Ukraine, especially in the case of a war between Russia or Ukraine, where either those children are dead or they're like not being cared for at all. What do you want?
Extend link number 2, where when the Supreme Court rules, it'll be permanently codified.
Yeah, and extend the link 2 on the Supreme Court rule in particular, because the Supreme Court has to rule in the case of this and something like this, it would probably be put up to court, because your fiat is durable. We would argue that this would go to the courts and that fiat is durable, which means it would rule for you, which is where this gets put into precedent in the first place. Politics, I kind of want to kick politics.
Fine.
Yeah, we'll kick politics. We're going to concede the, whatever. We'll concede winners win. On the case arguments, on the solvency arguments, or on the background, they say that they've done it before, but their only example is World War II, particularly looking at the federalism arguments. If nothing else, this probably means that Republicans would do a lot in their states, like not accept the money, for example, which is a pretty good argument since they have it. There are states that don't accept federal money, but the counterplan fiat means they have to do it in the first place, which also acts as a solvency deficit on their part, because they can fiat that the money gets allocated, but they can't fiat that the states necessarily accept it. And if they do, we can read our new arguments about why you don't get to fiat the states when you're the federal government. But the states mean that we guarantee the solvency on the counterplan, which is a net benefit to the counterplan in its own right, and a solvency deficit on their part. They say advantage one children, they say delinquency is going to go up because children are locked in caves. We would argue that even with these state programs existing and the federal programs existing, there's simply no preponderance of being able to solve for such large numbers. Like there are, which means that you can give them some solvency, but they're not going to be able to solve for this in the kind of systemic ways that they're talking about, which means that when you are looking at the solvency debate, don't assume that it's the solvency of the entirety of all of their advantages based on just possibly Russian war. You have to understand that there is no way that $80 billion is going to be enough money to be able to deal with both of these advantages at the same time. So you can give them some preponderance of solvency here. I don't have enough time to make any other real arguments on this, but we would argue that the war is going to outweigh, especially in their framework when they say policy making and stuff, and that these same impacts apply to Russia and Ukraine as well on the dissent level. I need to get some water. I will be right back. Whew.
Cool. So it'll be the counter plan, and then federalism.
Okay.
Good stuff. And then, yeah, we'll go then the 2 advantages in order. Alright, ready? Cool. Alright, at the point at which the counterplan is able to pretty much solve the entirety of the affirmative, it's really going to come down to the perm as the only way out for them. Onto the perm. On their first argument that it's not mutually exclusive, our argument is that it is exclusive through the net benefit, and that means at the point at which it's biting into the disadvantage, you're still going to have unique reasons to prefer counterplan on its own as opposed to the perm, and we read a bunch of reasons as to why doing both itself is uniquely bad, which means we're still competing in that sense. But the second argument is that the CP is going to solve back for the federalism disad, but it's not going to do that because of our highway funding example that we very specifically articulated and gave to you. We raised literally the drinking age to the 21 contingent on states accepting this funding. What the federal government does when it gives states funding is it essentially makes it into a blackmail issue where if they don't implement the policy to the exact specifications of the federal government, the funding instantly gets ripped away. You can look at No Child Left Behind is a fantastic example of that. But additionally, their argument under here in the states can't provide funding. We give you a list of 8 or 9 states that have specific programs very much like this. The Oregon Health Plan is an example. In California, Louisiana, the Washington Childcare Subsidy Program. This means the infrastructure is currently in place. This means the states do have the ability to take the money and move it elsewhere. So there's no unique solvency takeout there on behalf of the perm. The perm is not going to be able to solve better, and additionally is going to bite into the federalism disad onto the state budgets. They see budgets are on the brink of the status quo. However, we we very specifically gave you warrants as to why this isn't true. Our first argument was that HSR proves that at least California in this specific instance isn't, and the second argument, which is that California is the 7th largest economy in the entire world if it were its own sovereign nation, are probably 2 reasons why you're not going to be buying their argument that state budgets are entirely on the brink within the status quo. Then they claim it's a drastic overstretch of program. However, our argument is that fiat is going to ultimately be durable in this instance. They said that the impact is that it's going to collapse all of these social programs, and we pretty much are claiming that the states wouldn't allow this to happen just from moving money around from existing programs that they already have. They're not going to cut their worst programs.
Worst
They'd
case
be,
is tax increases. But
yeah, I mean, worst
impacting
case is
that
tax
else.
increases, but if they're not going to impact that, I'll provide you with very specific and detailed articulation as to why that would be uniquely bad in this instance. You're going to be always preferring the counterplan because it can solve the entirety of the affirmative without biting the federalism dissad. On the federalism dissad, unfortunately, they're not doing enough work here and anywhere past the uniqueness level, and even then, they're not winning uniqueness. Their uniqueness argument is that federalism is terminally low within the status quo because of the expansion of the American Health Care Act. However, it was literally based on a Massachusetts state policy. This is an example of state policy as superior and is then adopted by the federal government and like instituted on a massive level. This is an exact instance proving federalism solves. That really supercharges our uniqueness story in this example. Then they give the example of education. It's always been a federal power, so this will never be conceived as a shift. However, this is absolute BS. As my partner said, there's no united singular national curriculum prescribed by the Department of Education. The Department of Education simply exists to throw out generic standards and be an overseeing body, but the specific states are all the ones that do things like teacher evaluations, student evaluations. The only thing that's national about this process are is one private company, and that's the College Board. Other than that, this is run very specifically by states, which means we're going to be winning the perception link that this is a shift. We are absolutely winning the link that is a shift, and we're absolutely winning the uniqueness claims. At the point in which we are winning the uniqueness claims, the federalism is high in the status quo, and we're winning the uniqueness claim that education has been an issue controlled by the states historically. That means we're going to win the perception argument. At that point, they're not putting enough specific argumentation onto the Ukraine scenario as to why this isn't going to happen. Their real only example they give here is that of Iran. At the point in which they're only giving you Iran and Iraq, which are 2 governments that were set up by the United States specifically and aren't modeled. That's the very key difference, is the Ukraine Prime Minister specifically articulated last week, this is incredibly recent, that he's modeling specifically after the federalist ideas of the United States. He's arguing that they need to model the states, which means we're the only people that have the propensity to solve. On the impact level, you're going to see our impacts happen. Yeah, in essence, all of their impacts that are going to be happening not only in the United States, which can probably be resolved by the counterplan, but additionally they're going to be amplified overseas, especially in places like Russia and Ukraine and that entire region, which means the only way you can have any propensity to solve is a vote for us. Yeah, that's what we're doing.
Okay. Overview. Counterplan. Federalism. And then it's going to the case in the order of advantage 2, advantage 1. Everybody ready?
Yeah.
The first reason why you're signing the ballot for Nevada today is because of the perm. Yes, it's not mutually exclusive, but when we're winning federalism, there's going to be no reason why this is actually competitive and it's going to go away. The second reason is that we are actually winning federalism because our no link you're not interacting with. We are telling you that the federal government is giving them money and then the states have the ability to use this in however they want. You do not respond how this is not empowering the states, which means that when giving them the ability to use it as they please empowers the states, there is absolutely zero link to federalism and no propensity for this. This is a straight turn as well because you can see that we are empowering the states, which means that the states are going to be strong and able to check this back. The third reason why we're winning is because systemic violence is going to be outlaying. When you straight concede case and you never make arguments on it, having the ability to check the systemic violence is always going to be key. Because when you have no value to life, you're not going to be evaluating their death impacts because if you don't have a value to life, your death impacts don't matter. Going on to the counterplan. Extend across the permutation. I need your timer. Mine is dying. Extend across the permutation. They say that this still bites the DA, but you can cross-apply that we're not actually biting the DA. Additionally, we say that that this is going to uniquely balance the powers and basically check back the entirety of the federalism disadvantage, which means that they're never going to be getting access to this. Additionally, the only other argument we need on this piece of paper is if you don't buy the perm, you can buy the DA on state budgets. They are trying to fiat that 50 state constitutions are going to change. That's probably a bigger link to their own disadvantage than our entire case. But anyways, you're still gonna overstretch state budgets. You can look to the fact that California just recently cut, it was about $3 billion from the education budget because they didn't have money. Whether they can deficit spend or not, they still have to make choices, and if you force them to make billions of dollars into a childcare program, they're going to cut from something. And then when they cut from the welfare, or when they cut from food stamps or social programs like Medicaid, you're still going to be seeing the impacts that we're talking about, where people don't have the ability to feed themselves or get access to medical care, and then they have to die because they don't have the ability to provide for themselves, which means that the DA to the counter plan is enough for you not to be voting on this. Yep.
They give some examples about where their infrastructure is, but what about the states that don't have it, like Tennessee? That doesn't have
Yeah, and what about states that don't have infrastructure? And California, like, their infrastructure example is just another example about how states spend irresponsibly. Why would we be giving them money if they're just gonna spend it in places that they shouldn't be? This is probably another reason why you shouldn't be looking to the disadvantage. Going on to federalism. They say that this is about perception. We are giving money to states and letting them choose, which means that our perception is on the right side of this. Additionally, you can extend across the non-unique. Obamacare, which was a massive override, whether it was based on Massachusetts or not, was still a mass override of state regulations, which means that we are still winning this non-unique, that the federalism is extremely low in the status quo. You can look to the fact that we strong-arm states into expanding their Medicaid programs to force them to fund this is probably another reason why they're never going to be winning that federalism is particularly high right now, especially when we've done like tons of federal overhauls, like No Child Left Behind, which means that you can extend across the no link here, saying that we have federal oversight. If it's all about perception and if it's all about what we're doing, then the federal oversight on education is probably already enough to have triggered your link. If there wasn't, like, if there is any Brink scenario here, which there isn't, then this already would have happened because the perception is that the federal government is controlling this, which means that there's no reason why this is going to look like a huge federal overhaul. Which means they're not getting access to any of their impacts. You can extend across the fact that when the U.S. is actually involved in this type of stuff, they create strong central nationalist governments. There is no reason why Ukraine is going to do this. Additionally, there's no reason why Ukraine is going to be changing their entire constitution and fixing it to model like a weak system. The U.S. is going, like, they're going to model what they model, and basically when it's already non-unique, there's no triggered or link scenario. There's no reason why they're getting their impacts, and additionally, like, the biggest argument that they just don't interact with at all here is that we are giving the money to the state so they can use it as they please, which means that we're not doing a federal overhaul whatsoever. Going on to case. On Advantage 2. Just extend across the systemic violence. This is always going to outweigh because it leads to situations where people have absolutely no value to their life, which means that any death impact that you're granting them is irrelevant because people don't care about dying when they don't feel like their life has any value. This is always going to be a prior question to this, and we have the ability to check it back by giving funding and expanding seats and allowing people to create their own lives and actually have their own support system and not have to rely on others, which is always going to be able to outweigh any nebulous impact of Russian aggression.
Well done.